1974. Time of interview, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Place of interview, 802 North Ash. Interviewer, Mrs. Hazel Morris. Hazel Disney Morris. Address, 802 North Ash. Age of interviewer, 70. Tell us about your place of birth and parents.
Well, I was born near Perkins, or really it was near the town of Goodnight, but we had the doctor from Perkins, and his name was Dr. Sexton. And we lived in my grandfather's, in my uncle's home. My father farmed there, and he had come here and taken the land in the run my uncle had, and we lived on his place. And I was born in a little 2-room log cabin. It was this place where we lived was near the Cimarron River down by Goodnight. And I was born August the 10th, 1903.
Describe your hometown of Goodnight as you remember it when growing up.
Well, as I told you, I was born down by Goodnight, and I had 3 brothers older than I am, and they went to the school down by Goodnight. It was a very tiny town, and my folks lived in Goodnight. My daddy worked for Mr. Well, anyway, he worked, was the meat cutter in this grocery, on the one and only grocery store in Goodnight, Oklahoma. And the reason we moved from down there, they had this terrible flood down there, and my dad says, I'm going to get out of this place. He would butcher and cut up meat and then sell it in this store himself. This store in Goodnight was run by a man by the name of Mr. Ralston.
Family telling these stories to you while you were growing up that you remembered?
My grandmother was full of stories because they, before the opening of Oklahoma, they took some land up by Kansas, and my grandfather wasn't a good farmer, or he'd always lived in town, so he went to dentist school and went to schooling and got to be a dentist. And in the meantime, while he was gone, she lived in a dugout, and I've heard her tell about how they'd had those awful rains, and that she'd have to put dishpans and different buckets and things around to catch the water that would run in that dugout. And then as soon as he came back, the Oklahoma, of course, opened in 1889, and then they came right after that in 1890. See, it opened in April. Well, they came here in 90 on the train, and she told me that my grandfather Slocum, the one that was the dentist, he built the first house in Guthrie. It was down here on Mance or someplace, and he had an office downtown here in Guthrie years ago. He was like I say, the first dentist, and he used to get a big kick out of telling when he'd pull people's teeth. Now, what else do you want me to say? Let's see. Let me think.
Your family ever have anything to do with Outlaws?
Well, this happened on the way from Kansas down when my husband's father, grandfather, and uncle they run. Of course, they were in a wagon, and so they had to stop and stay all night at a place. And my grandfather, her husband's grandfather, he was so superstitious of this place where they stayed that he let the rest of them sleep, and they laid there. I've got a story about this, and he laid there all night awake, and they found out later that they stayed at the Bender, what do you call it? Anyway, where the Benders took people in, and they would kill the people, steal their horses and everything they had, and they would want them to eat in this house where they had a very beautiful daughter, and she'd get around and kind of blanny them, and they'd sit there and eat, and then they would flip a door, and down they'd go, and it would kill them, see. Well, my grandfather was suspicious, and they never did go on in because they had things to eat that they could, didn't have to go in and eat at this place. They just drove the wagon up there and stayed all night. And then they went on the next day, and they found out later that this was the Benders. Is that all right?
Country schools like in those days?
Well, the first country school I went to, it was west of this little wide place in the road, Goodnight. And, they would be, I expect, around 40 people or boys and girls that went to school there. And I remember the year I started when I was 6 years old. It was so crowded, and there were some folks in the neighborhood that I thought a lot of, and I was raised in this family of 7 children, and I was the 4th child. And my brothers had taught me my ABCs before I started school. Well, these girls that went and that I still keep up with, one of them, they were twins. One of them has passed. And the school was so crowded that the teacher let the 3 of us, we were all in we called it the primer then. We were all in the primer, and I taught these girls their ABCs. And they would be some grown-ups that was, well, I expect 16 or 18 years old in this school, because it seemed like people didn't get along in school fast like they do nowadays. Is that enough? And then at Paradise I went to school in Coyle. I went to Coyle to high school. Is that all right?
You said you were a teacher. Could you tell us something about the years you were teaching?
Well, I was in high school at Coyle, and my teacher picked out 3 girls I wasn't through high school yet, but she picked out 3 girls in this high school to take the teacher's exam and teach in the country schools. I happened to be one of them. She went with me to Camp Russell, and there used to be a camp out here at Camp Russell in the early days, and I believe they called it a Negro camp in the beginning, and it was out there not too far from the railroad track. And anyway, my teacher took me to the home of Mr. and Mrs. Charlie Morris and recommended me for this school, this Camp Russell school. And I got to school and taught there 1 year, and I captured my husband there.
Mrs. Morris, what year was this in?
19 and 22, 21 or 2, I don't know which was. Well, don't make a lot of it. I think it was in 1921 to 22 I taught there. Yeah, that's right.
Back to when you were a little girl, what were the holidays and Christmases like that you can remember of?
Well, Christmas was always quite a special day with us, and of course I had those 6 brothers, and I was the only girl. And Christmas was the only time that we ever had bananas or something kind of extra like that. And my dad would usually buy bananas at that time. And, of course, he used to buy us candy nearly every time he went to town. But then on the 4th of July, we would all get in the lumber wagon pulled with a team of horses and go to this town of Perkins, and they'd put on the July the 4th celebration over there. And, of course, we thought it was wonderful, and just to get a drink of that red pop that they used to have. It was a colored, I don't know, it colored water, I guess. Anyway, we just thought that tasted so good. And my mother would always fix a big picnic lunch. And we'd go to the park, and we'd all eat out there at the park, and then go back to celebration.
Did your father think of firecrackers and things back then?
Well, of course, by me having these brothers, they were very fond of firecrackers. My father used to buy each one of us a little small pack. I suppose it cost about a nickel or a dime. And I remember one time my oldest brother, he was just crazy about firecrackers. So he would save what little money he'd get all year. And because very little money did we have to spend, because there's too many in the family. With mother and father, you see, there'd be 9. And so one time, I remember that he had Roman candles, and we had a tall windmill that pumped the water for the stove. And he climbed clear to the top of that windmill at night and shot these Roman candles so they'd really go high.
Mrs. Morris, do you remember anything about Easter?
Well, I went to a little country church. They called it Hopewell. And I went to Sunday school, and I know they used to have programs there. I remember one time, I believe it was Easter or Children's Day. Now, I couldn't tell you for sure which, but it was a long time ago. And they asked, I wasn't even old enough to go to school yet, and they asked me to speak a piece. Well, it was only 4 lines, and I practiced and practiced, and so when I got to the church, why, there was one girl got up and spoke her piece. And I said, I guess it's my time now, because she spoke hers. They didn't even call my name, and I got up and walked up there and bowed my head and said my little piece and come back down. And my mother felt like taking a stick to me, because they didn't call my name. And her friend that sat by her says, don't you dare touch her. That was too nice that she went up and done that so nice. Is that all right?
Yes.
We used to color the eggs and hide them, and it seemed like before Easter, why, the hens would about quit laying, because my brothers would go to when they thought the folks didn't know it, and they'd hide these eggs away so they'd have a lot for Easter. I remember one time my dad would have to dig a post hole to keep the stalk in, and he dug right down where my brother had buried these eggs to have for Easter. That's the truth. And Easter was a big day to us, and we colored them and tried to see how many we could get. And we thought so much of them we wouldn't even hardly eat any of them because we liked them. Thought they were so pretty.
It's the most exciting thing which happened during your early days.
Now this is to be on my... Can't think of anything that happened that was really exciting. I know there were, but right now I can't think of it.
Okay. Life being the only girl out of the family with 6 brothers.
Well, it was really nice in a way and bad in another way, because I had one brother especially that was very jealous of me. And of course my aunties all thought a lot of me, and they would send me things, and there was 6 boys in the family and only 1 girl, so if anything was sent, why, I got it, and of course that would make a little disturbance there. I would get a new dress or some ribbons or maybe some jewelry or something that I really needed was always material for a dress, and Mama would make my dresses, see. Is that all right?
Can you remember anything that happened at school that you can remember?
Well, this isn't too good to tell because it's kind of on me in a way, but we had a neighbor that had a girl about my age, and I used to, in the evening, I would ride back. I had to go to school over and walk across fields with those brothers. There would be maybe four, I think there was 5 of my brothers and me went to school at one time. Then the 2 younger were too young then. And anyway, Mr. Phillips had told my father, said, now Hazel can always ride with Clarence and his sister home in, it was a little 1-horse buggy, no top on it, and I could stand up at the back and ride home with him so I wouldn't have to, round the road, it was 2 miles and a quarter. Well, I loved this Pearl, this little girl that I rode with, and we would eat her lunch outside together. And we'd go out and sit in the buggy at noon and eat her lunch, only when it was too cold. And so one day we went out there, and there was one of the boys that he was pretty mean in school and always in a fight or something. And there he sat in that buggy, and I said, you get out of there. You get out of there. We want to get up there to eat our dinner. Well, he just sat there and grinned and wouldn't budge an inch. So finally, I kind of clumb up on the step of the buggy, and I said, you get out of there. And he wouldn't budge, and I drawed back my fist and hit him in the nose, and the blood just spurted. Well, he got out of the buggy. And did they ever hoorah this boy? And so my brother, older than I, we sat together at school, and see, he didn't get along with school quite as well as I did, and we were in the same grade. And so we got inside the school, and I grabbed my geography book, and if I wasn't studying hard, because I didn't know what the teacher was going to do to me by me hitting that boy in the nose and blood in his, and the blood spurting like it did. So anyway, Dwight punched me in the ribs, and he says, now you're sure going to get it. And, well, I was just scared to death, of course. And we all got seated and sit down, and the teacher, she just said, now I want to tell you something. I do not want any more fighting on the school ground. That was all that was ever said. I guess she thought he got what was coming to him because he wasn't supposed to be up there in that buggy. Is that okay?
Yes. Tell us some more things about the school that you went to when you were a girl.
When we had those cold winter days, there was a pond that would freeze over, and my oldest brother did love to skate, and he would go an hour earlier, and and the other brothers and I would come. He'd skate on that ice on the pond until we came along, and then he'd go on to school with us. I thought that was good.
Appliances did you have, and tools that your dad and mother used when you were growing up?
Well, my dad used to plow. He'd hitch a team of horses to a 1-horse plow and do the plowing that way. And then he had 2 horses that he would hitch to the cultivator. And he would, one year he had out 125 acres of cotton. He was a big cotton farmer because he had to bring in a little money to take care of 9 in the family. And then we had a buggy that we had what we called the ponies, Topsy and Dolly. And my mother used to drive them to the buggy, and I used to go with her, and we belonged to a little country home demonstration club. And it was my job always, they'd call on me to play a piece on the piano for this club meeting. Usually I had to do that. That was what they usually ask me to do. And then, see, what else was I going to do?
What kind of utensil?
And my mother had the old-fashioned stove with, let's see, there was 4 lids and 6 lids. It was a big old, it stood up on little legs, and of course the oven was below the lids. And she baked old-fashioned bread. She would bake twice a week for our family because it took so much bread, and she had the old-fashioned yeast that you keep down in the basement. She used to can as many as 300 quarts of peaches a year, and all kinds of other fruit, grapes and pears and apricots, make a lot of apple butter and canned apples, and we'd dry apples and get them, we'd have to go out and put them on the roof of the barn. It was one of those, metal, that has it has ridges in it, and we'd fill those ridges full of peaches or apples and have to go out every night and cover them so the frost wouldn't, keep them from getting dried. After they were dried, then we put them in a flour sack, and they was hung on the line to be sure they was dried good, and then they were put away for the winter, the apples and the peaches. That's what we dried. And then this bread that my mother baked, this was the old-fashioned yeast, and we always kept it in the basement. We didn't have any ice boxes in those days. We put the milk in big crocks, brown crocks, in the basement, and she would skim the cream off and make our butter. We didn't have any oleo or anything like that in those days. And she'd make this oleo, and this butter, and that was what we eat on that good hot bread. I remember I was real naughty one time. I set the table, and she had this good fresh bread baked that day, and how I loved that crust of bread. And so I had an apron on that had a big pocket in it, and so I cut that crust off and put it in my pocket. So, of course, all the brothers, they liked that crust too, and they said, "Mama, where is the crust of the bread?" She says, "Well, I don't know, honey. It's supposed to be there." I never said a word, but I got the crust of the bread that day.
Remember the type of doll you had when you were a little girl?
Well, let's see. I still have 3 of my dolls. The first doll was probably close to 10 or 12 inches. Had a china head, and the rest of it, all but the hands, were china too. The legs were made of some kind of material, and then the other doll was a kid body, and it was a very cute doll with a china head. And I remember when my youngest brother was a baby, I loved that little doll, and it had the prettiest, this china head, had the prettiest head of blonde hair. And of course he didn't know any better. He was just a baby walking around, and he got a hold of my doll, and he just whammed it on the floor or something and broke his little head all to pieces. And I cried and cried, and my mother says, "Now, honey, don't cry. I'll buy another little head for that doll." And then one of my brothers was sick one time, and the doctor from Coyle, that was another town where we shopped to get our groceries, and it was a small town. They called the doctor, and he had to come out there one time when the snow was so deep that he couldn't come by the road, the highway, what we call highway now, we call it the road. And he had to cut across the fields to get to our house. The snow was so deep. And anyway, when the second time that he come out, why, he saw that the folks had this little girl, Hazel, and so he brought me the cutest little doll. and it had a little red dress on it, and of course I loved red, and I thought that was the cutest doll I ever saw. Just 'cause I was the only girl, he brought me the doll.
Thank you. Did you play with any other kind of toys that you can remember?
Anyway, with other what? Well, I used to play, we used to play what we called house out in the yard in the summertime. And we had four, let's see, they were big plum trees, those great big blue plums, and they was four that made a square. And my brother and I lived in one of them, and then the other two brothers, they lived way off, and we fixed us up what we called a telephone. And we'd call one another and took a spool and put that up to our ear, and we'd holler, hello, hello, so, say it would be James. And I remember one time I was said, well, I've got to can fruit, and so we'll have to dig a little cellar to put my fruit in. So I put some stuff in some little tiny jars or bottles or something I had, and I dug a hole in the ground, and we made what, my brothers helped me, and we made what we called a cave. And I set them down in there just 'cause my mother used to always keep everything in a cave. Is that all right?
Mm-hmm. Styled in like what? How did you wear your hair and your clothes?
Well, my mother, of course, being a large family, she had to save everything she could. So by these aunties always sending me some material and things for dresses, she'd make me some real pretty dresses. They'd be pleated skirts or gathered skirts, and they was always made just a little bit below my knees. And my hair, I had very long hair. My mother was very proud of my hair. She used to use a lot of Vaseline on it, and she said that made it grow so nice. And she used to have the boys and me all to get ready for school, and we'd have to leave, you see, a little bit before 8 to walk that those 2 miles to school to be sure to get there on time. And so a lot of times she combed my hair the night before. She'd put a little braid up on top on either side, parted my hair in the middle, and then she put braided little braid kind of at the side of each that in front. And then she'd pull that back to the back and put it in the long braids, and then she would roll up those braids and kind of like a ball and tie ribbons around them. And I always had beautiful ribbons because my aunts would always kept me in the ribbons. They'd send them to me for birthday and Christmas. And that was the way I wore my hair.
Okay. Ms. Morris, what was your first job?
Well, I was, as I told you a while ago, I was picked out of the school at Coyle to take the teacher's exam, and I passed the examination. And my first job was teaching school at Camp Russell. And that year, I had 39 enrolled on school, and I had all grades. And it was really a job to get all those grades in. And but I made the riffle with it. And then after that, I married this fella that I met out there. And we moved to Guthrie, and soon after that, I went to work at the Lentz department store here at Guthrie, and was a clerk there for between 25 and 30 years, off and on. I didn't work steady all that time. I worked steady for quite a while, and then you want me to tell you about Tinker and all that? Yes. And then when World War II come along, why, I felt it was my duty to help out with the war situation. So I went down to Tinker, we called it Douglas, down at Tinker Field at Oklahoma City, and got a job down there. And I was lucky, I got a real nice job. I was a tool crib operator. And I worked down there 2 years, and then I decided to quit, and I came back home. And as soon as I got home, my Lentzes wanted me back down there, back to work at the Lentz dry goods store. Is that enough?
Yes. Thank you. This is Paula Irene Woodward, February the 22nd, 1974, at 2:15 at 802 North Ash, interviewing Mrs. Hazel Morris, and we thank you for your interview.